Good afternoon. It's an honor to be speaking here today, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. It's a little daunting to be speaking to such a mixed audience of people, your professors and your colleagues and people you don't know. But I am happy to be here sharing my story and the story of Ruth today. Have you ever had a friend or a friendship that you kind of had to grow into? So maybe there was a person that you didn't have anything necessarily against, but you didn't really think you had a lot in common with, or you just weren't really interested in hanging out with them a lot. But then later, maybe you become close friends, or you realize they're actually a pretty edifying friendship in your life. Well, that's how I feel about the book of Ruth. Ruth is an unexpected friend for me. And I grew up in church. I grew up in a Christian home and going to a Christian school, so I learned the story of Ruth at a very young age. And I just never really loved it. So in my Christian school, we had themes for chapel each year, like the theme this year here is stories and parables. And I was in elementary school, I don't remember which grade. The theme that year was the books of the Bible. And we had a different transparency for each book of the Bible, and there would be some type of way to, for us to remember the name of the book and something about it. So Genesis, one of the N was really big. So it'd be like, oh, the big N, the beginning. And, so Genesis is the beginning. Okay, and then Exodus, you're like, Exodus is the exit of the Israelites from Egypt. And we would get to the book of Ruth, and they'd put the transparency up, and we'd all say, Ruth, a love story. But as a little girl, you have the story of Ruth, and then you have, Disney fairy tale romances, and they don't really compare. And, I'm a city girl, Ruth is out, collecting wheat, and marries this random guy from a threshing floor. I don't know, right? So as a child, you're like, that's kind of sketchy, don't really get it. Or in Sunday school, I remember learning about the story of Ruth, and we talked about how Naomi was really upset, and she really wanted to change her name to Mara. And I thought that was ridiculous, and was like, why are you throwing a tantrum, and you're going to change your name? How absurd. I didn't really understand, heartbreak and the horrible loss of losing your family. So I just thought Naomi was absurd, and why would anyone name their daughter after her? Because she didn't even want her own name. So growing up, I wouldn't have ever said I would be preaching on Ruth or writing papers about Ruth because we weren't friends. But through the last few years, as I've approached the book of Ruth with academic questions or these research questions, each time I approach the text, I walk away spiritually transformed. And so I'd like to share how that's kind of happened with you today. So my last year of my master's degree, I was trying to crank out a thesis and study for my comps, and I often describe my master's degree experience as walking through the valley of the shadow of death, which is funny because I use a hyperbole, but I'm actually being serious. So it was a horrible experience. It was a stressful year. I was working 40 hours a week. I was on staff at another university in town. I was leading a ministry at church, and I really started struggling that year. And I started going into a pretty dark place. And even it affected me physically. My hair started falling out at a certain point. I was having dental issues. I didn't consider committing suicide because I really like rules and structure, and I knew that was against the rules. But I would pray. I would cry myself to sleep at night, and I would pray that the Lord wouldn't make me continue to live and that he would take me home. So it was walking through this darkness. And you could look at all of my problems during that time and think, those are first world problems. Or look at the stress and be like, really? But they felt really horrible then. And in the middle of that, one of my professors at Evangel, where I was on staff, was having a series of surgeries and asked if I would substitute teach in his Old Testament literature class. And I was bribed into doing it, so I did. And I just went according to the syllabus, and the thing that was assigned was the book of Ruth. I was like, fine, I can teach the book of Ruth. So I'm standing before this undergraduate class, and we start walking through the story. The story starts in the plains of Moab. This family has moved there because of a famine. It's Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons. Elimelech dies, but Naomi still has hope because she has 2 sons that can get married and still produce a future for her. And they get married to 2 Moabite women, but they also die, leaving 3 widows, which creates a very hard situation in the ancient Near East. And so Naomi decides, I can't stay here. I need to go back to Bethlehem and see if I have a future there, and tries to send her 2 daughters-in-law away. And Orpah says, fine. She protests at first, but then says, fine, I'll go back. And Ruth says, no, I won't go back. I'm going with you. Now, people are like, oh, how nice of Ruth. I think it was actually kind of more of a hardship that she went with her, but that's another paper and another story. But Naomi finally is like, whatever, and she doesn't talk to her the whole way back, but says, fine, you can go with me. And they go back to Bethlehem. And it says in verse 19 of chapter 1, so they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had to come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. So you can see Naomi is devastated. She returns back to this place, and she just feels this total rejection by God. And I was in a place that year when that finally resonated with me. And I thought, yeah, this is bitter. And now I get why she wanted to be called Mara. And I'm teaching this book in just a 50-minute session to a classroom of undergrads. And I'm trying to unpack, this is what a kinsman redeemer is, and then there's levirate marriage, and there's inheritance laws, and this is what happens at threshing floors, and what really happened at the threshing floor. And I don't know. Okay, and so I get to the end of class, and I have to kind of summarize the book. And I stood there, and I found myself saying this statement. The book of Ruth is a story of Hesed, of God's loving kindness and covenant faithfulness. It's a story of how God always moves from death into life, and from loneliness to family and legacy, from emptiness to fullness of life and future. Even in the darkest times, the Hesed of Yahweh is working for his children to give them life and a future. And in that moment, although I couldn't feel that truth, as I spoke Naomi's testimony, it's exactly what I needed to hear from the Lord. And it was a big moment for me, and I also had to teach 2 sessions of that. So I said that twice that day, where I'm like, and this is the gist of the story. And it would be that semester that I would meet with Dr. Boda, and I got accepted to McMaster Divinity College. I wasn't planning on going into Old Testament, so I found myself here in the fall being Old Testament, trying to figure out life. So it was a year later that I was back in Springfield, Missouri, and I was having dinner with the professor I was substitute teaching for. And in the middle of dinner, he stopped the conversation to say, Megan, your countenance is totally different. You look so much better and happier, like there's a total change in your life. So what I couldn't see then, or couldn't feel then, was that God was already at work bringing about these things to come. As Naomi and Ruth moved back into Bethlehem, she's saying, call me Mara. At the very end of verse 22 there, it says that she returned with her daughter-in-law, it also says, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The harvest was already coming in. As we move into chapters 2 and 3, we hear about the threshing floor, and Ruth goes out gleaning. Ruth now has to figure out, and Naomi have to figure out their identities and the way they're going to exist in this community. So Ruth is sent out into the fields to glean wheat. And she ends up having these conversations with the overseer and with Boaz, who's going to provide for her, and she takes back wheat to Naomi. And later Naomi says, well, you know, Boaz is actually our kinsman redeemer. You should go talk to him. How about you go talk to him at the threshing floor when you're all dressed up and uncover his feet and lay down there? So she has this exchange with Boaz at the threshing floor, and Boaz agrees to go negotiate for them to get married. And we tell this story. It's a really charming story, and I do now love the book of Ruth. But sometimes you're looking at it, and you're like, what is the point of this? And what are we getting from it? And Ruth's kind of an outsider, but kind of an insider. It's a problem that she's a Moabite. What are we doing? And as I started my degree here, we all have to take research methods if you're in the research program. And again, I wasn't really planning on doing Old Testament, so I didn't have a dissertation topic in place, but Dr. Evans really needed something. And in Hebrew, we were translating Ruth, and I was like, well, I'll just write about Ruth. So I had to figure out a topic. And one reason I wasn't interested in studying Ruth before was because I love Ezra. Ezra and Mordecai are my two favorite Bible characters. And people often read Ruth as a counter to Deuteronomy and Ezra. I also really love rules and structure, and I sometimes ask for them. So I don't like when people put Ruth up against Ezra, because I love him, right? Or when they're trying to say Ruth is breaking the rules. Don't love that either. So I was like, I don't want to talk about that story. So I was like, well, is there any other way we can talk about this? And I started looking at, when does Ruth speak in the book of Ruth? And she actually doesn't speak at all in the context of women. So when they go into Bethlehem and the women come around and say, oh, who is this? Naomi talks, but Ruth is silent. Ruth will talk to Naomi, but whenever she's talking out in public, it's to men. And you find her in the places of men. She goes out gleaning, but she has lunch with the reapers, not with the maids. And she has this conversation with Boaz, and she's like down at the threshing floor. I was like, well, this is really interesting. So I proposed in research methods that we could read the book of Ruth as a foil to the men of Israel in Judges. Because in Judges, you have the men of Israel messing up a lot. And the final narrative is about this concubine who's abused to the point of death and is then chopped up and sent out to the tribes of Israel as this call to action. Does anyone know where that concubine is from? Bethlehem. And the very last verse of Judges repeats this motif that everyone was right in their own eyes. So I made this proposal, and Dr. Evans very constructively pointed out that Ruth only follows Judges in our canon, but not in the Jewish canon. And that's valid and fair. So I'm like, okay, but it still starts with, and in the days that the judges judged, so we could say there's like a literary context. But that's fine. We'll go with the Jewish canon. and then we'll say, okay, so then where does Ruth fall? Well, Ruth falls after Proverbs. So maybe Ruth is the answer to the question in Proverbs 31, a woman of noble character who can find. Oh, well, I can find one, but she's living in Moab, and she doesn't look like what you think she's going to look like. So I explored these different interpretations, and in doing that, I also came to a new place in my own identity. When I started my PhD here, like I said, I wasn't really planning on being in the Old Testament Guild, and so I had to figure out what life was going to look like as a female Pentecostal in biblical studies. I had moved to a new country that creates some identity negotiation. How does this work? And it seemed like for my first 2 years, those aspects of my identity kept being brought up to me in these situations like, oh, well, you're a Pentecostal, or like, oh, you're a woman. And I was like, okay, thank you. I know, but why are we talking about that? Or what difference does that make? Or what will life look like? And while this is a very accepting place, and it has been a good experience here, there are just things you have to work out, like when all the guys are going to the pub to have like man talk, guy time, whatever, like, well, you're not going. And so your life looks different than theirs as a man being in a seminary. It just does. And so what do you do with that? Well, Ruth, in the same way, she's not just accepted whole cloth into maybe this Israelite existence. 6 times her Moabiteness, her ethnicity, is brought up. So what does that mean? Because you can read her Moabiteness in different ways. If you think about just the word Moab, it's a reference to the Moabites being descendants of incest. So you could say, well, every time it's brought up, you're like, oh, gross, she's a descendant of incest. Or you could read it in line with Deuteronomy that, okay, these people tried to seduce the men of Israel and turn them away from our God, so she is not good company. She should be excluded. Or you can just read it as, we don't get along with the Moabites. So why is this continually brought up? Or what does it mean that it's Ruth who is doing all these kind of like manly things, not acting like a man, but doing things we would expect the men to do. And at the end, the women actually say, Ruth is better to you than 7 sons, which really also helped my judge's interpretation. But what does that mean? And I finally came around to, all those things are literary tools that can help us be sensitized to the other things going on in the text. That when you realize it's a Moabite woman, all of a sudden, every time Hesed is used or the name of Yahweh is used, becomes a little more special, or you notice more, because it's maybe from the lips of a Moabite woman, or it's being used to describe a Moabite woman, or this interaction. And I think all of those things then heighten our sensitivity to what God is doing. And over the past 2 years, I've wrestled with, what is my future going to look like as an American Pentecostal woman in the Guild of Old Testament Studies? Or what does it look like being an ordained minister in the Assemblies of God when I'm the only single individual getting ordained and everyone else is married? Let alone woman, only non-couple standing at the front of that church being ordained. What does that look like? And coming to a place where I'm like, Lord, I'll do whatever you've called me to do, what you've called me to do. And it might be uncomfortable, and people like to point out my differences, but if it heightens their sensitivity to the work that you're doing, I'll do it. And I'll go wherever you need me to go. And it's really not my job to make other people okay with that. That's his. My job is just to be obedient and to have Hesed. As we move into chapter 4, we've had these negotiations where Ruth goes out into the fields and then to the threshing floor, and now Boaz is called to action. And so he says, okay, I'm going to go work out this marriage thing. I'll go to the city gate because there's actually a redeemer that's a little closer, and he gets first dibs. So he goes, and we have this negotiation where he seems to be leveraging a few laws or crisis customs at once. And this is where people start saying, okay, well, especially in light of her ethnicity, is he kind of twisting Torah? And is the author using this as a way to get back at Ezra, who is interpreting Deuteronomy? And again, I don't really like that because I want everyone to get along. But as I looked at it, and I had an SBL paper proposal coming due, I went to Dr. Bell and I was like, what am I supposed to write on? Whenever I say that, he's like, the Book of Ruth, which is funny because I told him I'll never write on the Book of Ruth for my dissertation. So every time I have a topic, he's like, write on Ruth. Oh, what should I preach on? The Book of Ruth. Okay. So I was like, all right, I'll propose a paper. It'll be about the Book of Ruth. It was for the biblical ethics section, and the topic was law and love. So I was like, okay, I think I can pull that off. You also have to know something else about me. I see the world in black and white. Like, I love rules and structure, and I like categories, and I really don't like gray area or ambiguity. I was telling this to Alex Breitkoff earlier, and he's like, no, you like black and white. Yes, I do. And my grandfather will often pull me aside and say, Megan, you need to temper yourself a little. Like, you're seeing things too much in black and white, and you need to maybe have a little more grace. Okay. So now I'm looking at this paper at law versus love, which is sometimes a struggle for me. And reading through the Book of Ruth, what do you do when Hesed, this loving kindness or this fierce love, is being ascribed to Boaz, to Ruth, to Yahweh? But then you are wondering if law is being manipulated in order to bring this about. But as I read the Book of Ruth and really explored what's going on, maybe sociologically and in this historical context, it really doesn't seem like law and love are butting heads, but more that the author of Ruth and these characters are working out, what does Torah look like in real time? What does Torah look like when it's applied to this community in Bethlehem when you have a widow of an Israelite man, who happens to be from Moab, coming in, and she needs to be provided for? What happens when Naomi really has no hope unless we can pull it together and help her out? And so in that paper, I actually argue that in the book of Ruth, we don't see law and love butting heads, but law and love working in tandem. Not in tension, but in tandem. Because it's only when Hesed and Torah work in tandem that we can be in right relationship with God and with others. And so as I've walked through the book of Ruth all of these different times, I didn't necessarily know that these things were happening to me or that I was being transformed as I was writing my papers or presenting or working through the text at an academic level. But as I look back, I can see, I've had this journey with Ruth the whole time. And although I wouldn't have said we were tight and that I particularly loved Ruth, each time I go to Ruth and dialogue, I come away edified and moved by the story of Yahweh there in it. And you wouldn't say that God's hand is explicitly seen there. But I think when you look at the book of Ruth, it really points to a faithful God who will take a Moabite woman to tell a story about his faithfulness and about his hesed, this fierce love and loving kindness that he has for people, in order to bring about transformation. So that this widow Naomi, who feels like his hand has gone out against her, will see the harvest has already started, and he's bringing her back into a place of fullness and of life. And so while I laugh about chapel all those years ago when I was in elementary school in that cinder block auditorium, and we would say, Ruth, a love story. I don't think it's a love story about Ruth and Boaz. I think it's a love story about God's unfailing hesed and how we are supposed to imitate that in our world. So with that, I'd like to pray together today. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you've brought us here together to learn from your word and to take time in this moment in a stressful part of our semesters or whatever we're doing in our lives to stop and focus on you. I pray that for those that are living in dark times, when it seems like your hand has gone out against them, I pray that you will continually bring people into their lives that will speak truth to them and that will display your hesed and your faithfulness. Father, I pray for those of us that are reveling in the harvest, Lord, or do feel your hesed and your presence. I pray that you will help us to be instruments of your peace and of your hesed, Father God. I pray that you'll be with us this day as we go forth, and that we'll be ever faithful to your name. In your name we pray. Amen.